Thanks, Isabella. Uh, well, damn it. I don't know why this thing is so sensitive. Okay, there we go. Sometimes I have the hardest time. Oops.
Just because Jeremy's a bad student doesn't mean that he's cheating on Bonnie.
Hey, I can hear somebody's watching a video or something. Sorry, everyone. I'm trying to figure out. I'm still having some connection issues here with my iPad. Don't. Sorry, trying to figure out what's going on with this thing. This is just the kind of day that it has been. Did you see? My screen popped up, my iPad popped up, and then it disappeared very quickly. Hmm. Okay. Maybe it's there. Can you see my screen now? Okay, good. Well, let's hope this works. I have no idea what I did. I guess that's always the dangerous thing. I don't know what I did to fix it, so hopefully that works. So if you remember where we left off, just before we took the quiz, we were talking about the cost of inflation. And just to kind of recap some of the things that we talked about. First off, the real cost of inflation is unexpected inflation. Right? When people don't anticipate inflation, right? They don't anticipate inflation, and so as a result, they're not prepared for it. And so we talked for a couple of reasons about why unexpected inflation is the most costly, right? We talked about the fact that unexpected inflation redistributes wealth. And we talked about how it makes ex ante real interest rates different from ex post interest rates. Right? So in other words, what you think the real return you're going to get on an investment ends up becoming much different than what the real return on the investment actually is, right? And so without going into all the details again, we worked through a couple of examples talking about how unexpected inflation redistributes wealth. It hurts lenders and it helps borrowers. We talked about how it creates transaction costs. Right, all those poor people in Brazil that are trying to wheel around wheelbarrows full of money to be able to buy things, right? Because what's happening is they've got to get rid of money as quickly as possible. So we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit later in class. We're going to talk about what is money. And one of the things we're going to find is that money is always used in modern economies because money has a way of making trade easier. And so inflation, by undermining the value of money, makes trade harder in many ways. And then we talked about malinvestment, bad investment. Inflation tends to encourage unproductive investments, right? Investments that don't lead to the overall productivity of the economy, and as a result, don't contribute to overall societal welfare. So we talked a lot about how unexpected inflation can be a bad thing, but one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about is that unexpected deflation can have these same costs, right? In other words, when inflation is less than what we thought, it can lead to the same sort of distortions. Let's think about an example, right? What happened during the Great Depression? Okay. During the Great Depression in the United States, we had inflation, actual inflation, of negative 25%. In other words, the price level fell by 25% in 1931. So prices were dropping like a rock. Well, that creates costs too, right? That creates costs too. Think about an Iowan farmer who had a loan on his farm. And I'm just going to make up examples here, but let's figure out what his ex-post interest rate was. And then we're going to figure out, well, let's begin by assuming something about his ex-ante interest rate, and then we'll figure out what his ex-post interest rate was. So let's think about that same farmer, that farmer kind of akin to the example I talked about this morning about my parents getting a mortgage. So let's say that farmer has a 30-year mortgage, okay? And let's say that he got an interest rate of 4%. Why did the bank lend him money at 4%? Well, they were probably thinking inflation was going to be 2%, and they were probably expecting an ex-ante real return of about 2%. And the farmer was expecting to pay about 2%, right? So, if they did this in 1929, that's probably a reasonable assumption about, what the going interest rate, the going nominal interest rate was, and what the farmer expected to pay in real terms. Now let's move forward to 1931. What's that farmer still paying? 4%. The farmer's still paying 4%. What's inflation? Negative 25%. Now, what's the ex-post real interest rate that this farmer's paying? 29%. 29%. That is a killer. During a period of a down economy, to then be paying a real return of almost 30% was disastrous. Who won in this? Well, let's do the loser first. Who was the loser?
Both the farmer and the lender.
Right. The farmer's clearly the loser, right? Because they're paying 30%. And in theory, who won? Well, the lenders or the banks. In theory, the lenders or the banks won. But Max, you said that everybody loses. Why did you say everybody loses?
Because it's the depression. The banks aren't doing too well either.
Yeah, well, but why aren't the banks doing well?
Shucks.
Shouldn't they get a 29% return?
No, if people don't have the money to give to them.
Exactly, right? That's the problem. How many farmers actually were paying 30%?
Probably none.
Not very many, right? In 1932, 50% of Iowa farmers were in default. Almost half of farmers weren't able to pay back these. And so in reality, banks lost as well. %40 of Iowa banks failed between 1930 and 1933. Right? Almost 40% of all Iowa banks fell during this period of time. And so unexpected deflation is not a good thing either, right? Unexpected deflation is not a good thing either. So listen, the thing about inflation is it can kill you either way. If it's unexpected, meaning if it's too high, or if it's too low, it can kill you, right? It can kill you. And so from a macro perspective, what inflation is best for growth? The key is stable inflation. In all honesty, from an economist point of view, there's probably not much difference between having a 1% inflation rate or a 2% inflation rate or even a 10% inflation rate. There's not that much difference. As long as it's steady and predictable, right? Being steady, being predictable is far and away the most important thing about managing an inflation rate. So we're going to talk a little bit later in class about where inflation comes from. We're going to talk about how inflation is directly related to monetary policy. And we'll come back to this question of, well, what inflation rate should we choose or should we target when it comes to monetary policy? And, you know, I think we're going to try to build this argument that in some sense, it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, as long as you meet your target. In other words, as long as you're providing clear guidance, clear expectations about what inflation is, and then you're meeting that goal, right? That has to be one of the important aspects of monetary policy, because unexpected inflation is so costly. So we'll come back and talk about what good monetary policy is, how central banks who run monetary policy can maintain stable inflation rates. And we'll also talk about why is it that some countries let inflation get out of control, right? What are the mistakes that are made that let inflation get out of control, okay? And so that's where we will turn, I can't remember exactly what day, but sometime next week, right? Sometime next week we'll return to this discussion about inflation. Okay, so that's really it for chapter 8, right? We kind of got through chapter 8, which is what we needed to get through today. So hopefully any questions about chapter 8 before we move on? So I'll tell you very clearly what I'm hoping to do. I would like to cancel class tomorrow afternoon. It seems like it's a long week. It seems like a lot of us have some catching up to do over the weekend. I personally hate Friday afternoon classes with a passion. There's something about getting a jump start on the weekend, and, you know, for me going home and doing laundry and all that kind of stuff. So my plan is that we will, if we spend a little bit of time talking about chapter 10, then we should be able to finish chapter 10 tomorrow morning. So we hopefully won't have class tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so just to give you kind of a heads up, that's where we're going to turn here now, is to cover some of chapter 10 so that we can kind of just have a half day tomorrow. And so chapter 10 is about savings, investment, and the financial system. So we're going to talk about finance in this chapter. We'll talk about the roles that finance plays in a macroeconomy, right? Talk about the ways that the roles that finance plays in a macroeconomy. All right, right off the bat, I'm going to ask you the hardest question of the afternoon. What is finance? If you had to explain what finance is, what is it?
Borrowing money to fund something.
What did you say, Evan?
Borrowing money to fund something.
Borrowing money to fund something.
How you manage your money.
How you manage your money. So borrowing money to fund something, does that mean that when you buy a stock, you're not engaged in finance? Because you're not borrowing money when you buy a stock. Managing your money, well, yeah. I mean, I can take my money out of my wallet and dig a hole in the ground and put my money in the hole in the ground. That's not really finance, is it? I mean, listen, finance is a hard concept. We act as if we know what finance is, right? We kind of know what finance is, but when it comes to actually explaining finance, this is probably one of those areas of economics where there is a great deal of, I don't know what to use the word, ignorance, right? Most of us really don't understand finance. Most of us really don't. We kind of think we do because we hear about it on the news, but when it comes to really explaining what finance is, what it does, yeah, you know, I don't think a lot of us know about it. Part of this is, I think, just a big hole in our education, right? That finance is really not something that's talked about, you know, in high schools or junior highs. And so, you know, as a result, most of us don't really quite understand what finance is. So let me give you a definition of finance that I think is all inclusive. Finance is trading money across time. Always with conditions attached. That's really all finance is you are trading money now for money later. That's what all financial transactions have in common. Trading money now for trading later with conditions attached. So if I buy a bond, what am I doing? I'm giving the bond issuer money. What will they give me in the future? Hopefully they'll give me interest payments. Okay, I'm trading money today for money in the future, and those have conditions, right? And the conditions are the interest payments. If I buy a share of stock, I'm doing the same thing. I'm buying a share of stock, I give the company money, and what does the company give me? Hopefully, no guarantees, but hopefully they'll give me a share of any future profits. So the conditions under which money is traded differ for a stock or a bond, but what they have in common is you're trading money across time. You're trading money today for money tomorrow. So you might ask yourself, okay, that's pretty simple, trading money today for money tomorrow. Why is that so important? It's very important to be able to trade money today for money tomorrow, right? The most important reason why this is important is because what good financial systems do is financial systems get resources from those who have them to those who have the most productive uses for them. In other words, finance is right at the source of entrepreneurship. What financial systems do is they take resources from those who have them and get them to those who have the most productive uses for them. Okay? Is there any guarantee that people who are rich also have the best uses for money? There is no guarantee of that. In fact, based on my own experience, I might actually argue the correlation is reverse. That some of the people who are rich, who have resources, have the least idea of how to use them productively. So if you are a young entrepreneur starting out, starting a business, right? You have this great idea. Where do you get resources from? You have to get it from people who have wealth. And that's what financial systems do. Financial systems essentially transfer those resources from those who have them to those who have a use for them, right? Finance is a key to entrepreneurship. As a result, it's a key to technology and innovation. Those of you who've taken an entrepreneurship class here at Cornell or are interested in taking an entrepreneurship class at Cornell, you'll find that really one of the first aspects of entrepreneurship is identifying your financial plan. You have to be able to figure out, how am I going to fund my business? And what that means is trading money today for money tomorrow. I give up money. To get money today, I have to give up some promises of money in the future. Hopefully when I'm making money through my new business. So like I said, I think I used this analogy this morning, but finance is like the brain of an economy. Just like when you're running, it's your brain that says you need to have more energy go to your muscles and your legs. That's very much what a financial system does, right? When there's a part of the economy that has a need for resources, good financial systems will get resources from places that they have them to places where they're needed. It's a big coordinating mechanism. And what's the coordinating mechanism? Markets, financial markets. The market to borrow and lend, right? The market to borrow and lend, or the market for stocks, right? These are giant coordination mechanisms that get money from those who have them to those who need it and are willing to pay a price to do it. Okay? So, we'll talk about innovation and technology next week as we begin to talk about economic growth. But one of the important things to recognize is that finance is one of those crucial hidden steps in technology, right? If you don't have finance, it's really hard to innovate because you simply don't have the resources to do it well. Finance also creates incentives to save and invest. For those who save, it gives them a return on their savings. What happens among the poor? One of the things that keeps poor people poor is a lack of finance, is a lack of all of the things that those of us who are Americans take for granted. The fact that you can go put your money in a bank and it will be safe there and it will give you a return, okay? In many countries that do not have financial systems, there's simply no good way to save. So how do they save? Sometimes they save by putting money in a mattress, which gives you very little return and it can be easily stolen. Or oftentimes what we see is we see people save by going out and buying things like a cow, right? Cattle, livestock. That's actually a not uncommon way that many poor people save. But the problem with that is it's not very productive, right? It's not very productive. I saw one recent study that indicated that the return on having a cow is about negative 50% a year. Right? In other words, you're losing half your money when you save it buying a cow. And so you might say, well, why in the world would people lose half their money? Because it's better than the alternative. The alternative is maybe losing all of your money. right? So, these are the tough choices that many people who don't have access to financial systems face. For those of us in the US, we've grown up with a very highly developed financial system. We take these things for granted. But for other countries, this is a huge issue. Finance reduces risk in a number of ways. Part of it is from diversification. For instance, if I want to invest in the stock market, what should I not be doing? Putting all of my eggs in one basket and buying one stock, right? Because what's the problem? If I buy one stock and that company goes out of business, I've lost everything, right? One of the cornerstone aspects of any financial management plan is diversification, because it helps you reduce risk. It helps you reduce your exposure to one potentially bad outcome. Finance also allows us to have liquidity. And liquidity is basically a fancy word for getting money when you need it. Right? So once again, this is something that we don't appreciate, most of us as Americans, because we have things like credit cards that essentially give us quite a bit of liquidity. If I don't have money this month, what can I do? Well, I'll put it on my credit card and I'll pay for it next month. That is liquidity. And that's something that most of the world does not have access to. And even in the US, many poor people don't have access to that kind of liquidity, right? You don't have credit cards unless you have financial systems, right? Unless you have stocks and bonds and banks and all that kind of stuff. And so, liquidity is absolutely crucial. And of course, liquidity reduces our risk, right? If we get sick and have to go to the hospital and we don't have any money, how do we pay for it? Put it on the credit card, right? I mean, that's an important way that we reduce risk. Finance reduces transaction costs. I'm reminded of this every time I go to the store and I see some little old lady writing a check in front of me and taking it 10 minutes to do it, right? The advent of credit cards and debit cards and, using Apple Pay, these are all ways that make trade easier. And so in this and in 1,000 other different ways, right, that we don't pay attention to every day, financial systems make trade easier. And so that, once again, leads to economic development. Finally, finance provides insurance. We don't usually, when you think about finance, you don't think about insurance. But insurance is an important part of finance. Right? You think about buying life insurance. What are you doing when you buy life insurance? You're trading money today for money tomorrow, right? I'll pay a premium today in the expectation that if I die tomorrow, I'll get the money back, right? So all kinds of insurance, whether you're talking about pensions or life insurance or fire insurance or auto insurance, health insurance, all of these insurance programs that you may or may not be a part of all rely heavily on finance because they are a form of finance. They involve trading money now for trading later, for money later. Okay? And so finance is a crucial part of our economic lives, right? It's absolutely crucial part of our economic life. And one of the things that we will talk next week we're going to spend a good chunk of the beginning of the week talking about that first question of what makes countries rich and what makes countries poor. And having a developed financial system is one of the things that plays a big role in helping rich countries become rich. And it's a big thing that keeps poor countries poor, right? Now, when we talk about finance, there's an important difference that we need to make clear. Because once again, there's some words here that economists use much different from the average person. And they are savings and investment. In fact, I can almost guarantee you that at some point I'm going to ask you this question on a quiz or an exam to explain to me the difference between savings and investment. And almost assuredly, many of you will miss it. Why? Because in real life, in everyday life, we kind of use these words interchangeably. We don't really make a big distinction between what is savings and what is investment. But as economists, we need to distinguish between these two activities. Okay? What is savings? Savings is postponing consumption or spending. Savings is the act of postponing consumption or spending. Okay. What is investment? Investment, we defined the other day. The purchase of capital goods, R&D, inventories, new housing. That's what we mean by investment. So, if I buy a share of stock, what am I doing? Saving or investing?
Investing?
Nope, I'm saving. And that's the problem, right? We have to be clear about this. I'm saving. Why am I saving? Because what am I doing when I buy a share of stock? I'm trading money. Oh, go ahead, whoever spoke.
I would say you're basically giving money away to get money back at a later date.
Right. Yeah. Right, Ethan. I wouldn't, yeah, I don't think I'd say giving money away, right? Because I do expect something in return, right? I expect money in the future for money today, right? I expect money in the future for money today. So that, the act of buying a share of stock is really savings. It's what economists consider to be savings. And I realize that's confusing because in real life, in our everyday lingo, we often refer to that as investing. But economists, when we talk about investment, we're talking about the purchase of capital or research and development or inventories or new housing, okay? So when I buy a bond, I'm saving. When I put money in a bank, I'm saving. Now, the key is, how are these two things related? Well, what financial systems do is they take savings and they turn it into investment. They take savings and they turn it into investment. In other words, they match savings with investment. So think about buying that share of stock. I save up my money, right? I don't spend all of my income. And what do I do with the amount of income that I don't spend? I postpone my spending by buying a share of stock. Let's say I buy a share of Apple stock. What does Apple then do with that money? They take it to purchase capital or research and development or inventories, right? In other words, they take my savings and they turn it into an investment. That's the purpose of a financial system. So whether it's a stock market or a bond market or a bank, banks do the same thing. When I save and put money in a bank account, what does the bank do with that money? They turn around and lend it out, right? They lend it out. Maybe they lend it out for somebody's new house, or they lend it out to a firm to, invest in their business, right? Financial systems take savings and turn it into investment. To see this another way, let's go back to our old friend, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus n. Let's go back to our expenditure equation that we developed the other day. Okay. And to keep it simple, let's assume that we have a closed economy. And by a closed economy, I mean no international trade. Right? So that x minus m is equal to 0, right? Let's just kind of assume away international trade to keep things simple. Okay? Now I want to complicate this a little bit. Let's let T be taxes and TR be government transfer payments, things like Social Security or Medicare, right? We've talked about government transfer programs, right? These are just the programs, government spending in which a government just takes money from some people and gives it to other people. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add and subtract T and TR. Okay, I'm just going to add and subtract taxes and transfer payments. So this is still true, right? I haven't changed anything. You're probably asking, where in the hell is Newt going? Well, I've got a plan here, as you might imagine, right? Now what I want to do is I want to lump some things here I want to lump some things together, okay? So on the left side, I'm going to put Y. And I'm going to put C over here. And I'm going to take that minus TR and put it over here. And I'll put that all together. And then on this side, I'm going to put T and put the G. Can move this over to the left side. I made a mistake, sorry. Because I want to put I didn't mean to do that. Still get confused using this thing. Right? I meant to put that all together. And we'll leave the I on the right-hand side. So I've basically just kind of moved variables around in a particular order. Why? Because I know what I'm looking for, quite honestly. Because what is this? Total income minus consumption minus your taxes plus your transfer payments. What would this be? This is actually private savings. This is how much private individuals save. Your total income minus your consumption spending, minus your taxes you pay, plus the transfer payments you get from the government, right? So in other words, if I take all my income in the transfers I get from government and subtract out my spending and my taxes, what's left over? My private savings. What's this? This is government savings. That's how much the government saves. In other words, this is the negative of the deficit. And what's I? Investment. If I put these two things together, this is total savings. So as a result, in a closed economy, total savings equals investment. In other words, any investment has to come from savings. Any investment has to come from savings. Once again, what comprises total savings? Private savings plus government savings. Okay. So in a closed economy, that has to be true, that total savings is equal to investment. So if we're going to invest more, what does our economy have to do? It has to save more, right? It has to save more. Who needs to save more? Either private individuals need to save more or the government needs to save more, okay? Or the government needs to save more. Now, we don't have a closed economy in the US, right? So let's think about this equation now as an open economy. What happens if we have an open economy? Then this equation becomes this. We just add back in exports minus imports. Or we can rewrite it like this. Savings minus investment is just equal to net exports.
I have a question.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Evan.
So what would, for say, something like gold be considered as? Because it's kind of a consumer good in a way, but also people sometimes will buy it for savings.
Well, buying gold is not a financial transaction. It's not a financial transaction. You're purchasing yellow rocks. So it doesn't even include, it's not even included in GDP because you're not producing anything new. So once again, you yourself might think of yourself as savings, but from an economic perspective, that's not really a financial transaction, right? Because once again, think back to our definition of finance. It's trading money today for money in the future. So yeah, you might think you're going to maybe get money in the future when you sell the gold, but you're not guaranteed anything, right? So buying gold is really in some ways not much different from investing in a piece of art or anything like that, right? It's not a financial transaction. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so in an open economy, this has to be true. Think about this. The difference between savings and investment has to be made up by our net exports. This is just an accounting equation, okay? This is just math. But already, well, I shouldn't say already, but maybe you're getting a sense here that this is a very important equation in understanding the way the world works. And in fact, I would love it if politicians understood this equation, because you would hear a lot less stupidity from them if they understood what this equation means. Can an open economy have savings that's less than investment or different than investment? Yes, but that difference is going to have to be reflected in their net exports. That difference is going to have to be reflected in its net exports. Okay? So why is that such an important insight? Well, let's think about the US. What's true about the US? The US has high level of investment. But on the flip side, we have very low savings. Why? Private savings is relatively low, but most importantly, our government runs big deficits, and meaning our government savings is negative. The government is essentially borrowing money year by year. And when savings is less than investment, what's going to be true about your net exports? When savings is less than investment, it has to be true that your exports are less than your imports. In other words, X minus M is less than 0. You have to run a trade deficit. You have to run a trade deficit if your savings is less than investment. Okay? It's just simple algebra. If a country spends a lot and saves a little, what's going to be one of the implications of that? They're going to run trade deficits, period. Because when they spend a lot, what are they going to do? They're going to import a lot. Okay, so hold on, because now I'm going to go on one of my rants here, okay? And, you know, listen, I'm going to pick on Donald Trump and Republicans here, though I have to admit, if you look historically, Democrats are just as Democrats find this just as incomprehensible as Republicans do. This idea that who is to blame for the US trade deficit? It's not China, it's us. We are to blame for our trade deficit, right? We are to blame for our trade deficit. Why? Because we save too little. We save too little. Our government borrows too much. Our private individuals save too little. What happens then as a result? We run a trade deficit. And it's not China's fault. It's our fault, right? Trade deficits are a function of domestic policy. How much we save, how much we invest. How much we save, how much we invest. So we run a trade deficit because we don't save very much, but we invest a lot. We spend a lot. If the US was serious about reducing our trade deficit, what would we do? We would run smaller budget deficits and we would try to save more, right? That's what we would do if we were serious about the trade deficit. So Donald Trump, who talked more about trade deficits than probably any president before him, talked over and over again about wanting to reduce the trade deficit. And what was his approach? We're going to blame China for us having a trade deficit. We're going to start a trade war with China. So how did that work out? Did that starting a trade war with China reduce the trade deficit? No, it increased the trade deficit. Right? It increased the trade deficit. Let me show you some data here. Sorry, the computer is running slow. Okay. So look at the US trade deficit since Donald Trump took over. So Donald Trump decided he was going to start a trade war with China. And we are going to import less goods from China. Of course, have we imported less goods from China? We have imported less goods from China. The unfortunate thing is we've also exported less goods from China, because that's what happens during a trade war. You reduce both your imports and your exports. But what happens to the difference between the two? The difference has gotten bigger. Why? Because our government budget deficits have gotten bigger. We save even less. So despite talking about ending the trade deficit with China and ending our trade deficit, the trade deficit has only gotten bigger. And why has it gotten bigger? Because, you know, Donald Trump doesn't understand the basics of economics, right? He doesn't understand the basics of economics, right? And once again, I'm saying this about Trump, but the same could be said of many liberals too, who don't seem to understand this relationship. That, you know, why does the US have a trade deficit? You know, we can blame China all we want, but it's really us, right? It's really us. And so that's why we have a trade deficit. They're related to savings and investment. What's true about countries that have a trade surplus? Well, just exactly the opposite is true. Let's think about a country like Germany. Okay? Germany has high savings. They have high private savings. To give you an idea of how high, the savings rate in the US is about 3%. Americans save about 3% of our income. Germans save between 16 and 20% of their income. So Germans save a lot, right? They save high private savings. And they have very low government deficits. In fact, the German government often runs a surplus. As a result, their savings is higher than their investment. What does this mean? Their X minus M is positive. They have a trade surplus. And Germany runs one of the biggest trade surpluses in the world. So if you actually want to see this in practice, you can just see here the difference between the US and Germany, right? On the left-hand side here, we have I, And then this whole bar is total savings, right? And the little green bar up at the top is or I'm sorry, the bar, this is actually a confusing graph. Actually, I'm not going to show this to you. I remember, actually, I forgot about this graph. I think it's actually a little confusing. So let me just say, Germany runs one of the biggest trade surpluses in the world, right? But it's not surprising. Why does Germany do this? Because they save a lot. And the same is true of China. Why does the US run a trade deficit with China? Why does China run a trade surplus with the US? Because China has a high savings rate relative to their investment. And so as a result, they're going to run a trade deficit. The US getting into a trade war with Germany or China is not going to solve that. The only way that's going to solve that trade deficit is if we save more or invest less. So, trade deficits and trade surpluses reflect basically our domestic policy, right? They reflect our domestic policy. So we're going to come back and talk about these equations multiple times this block. So I encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking over this, because we're going to refer back to this idea many, many times, because it's going to give us a lot of insight into, for instance, why we have trade deficits and what kind of things drive exports and imports, right? So the fact that this is just accounting, right? I mean, this is just simple math, right? Tells us a lot about why countries have trade deficits, right? And so one of the important things I want you to know is don't believe the politicians when it comes to this, right? Because one thing that we know is it's a lot easier to scapegoat other countries than it is to learn economics. And politicians prove this every day, right? What's easier? Asking people to understand economics or blaming a foreigner? It's a lot easier to blame a foreigner. Right? And so, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of economic issues, we see this over and over again, right? And this is not something that's necessarily partisan, because we see both sides do this at times. Instead of learning the hard things, the hard concepts, they really revolt to just scapegoating and blaming other people, right? And so that's definitely true when it comes to thinking about the sources of our trade deficits. Okay. So we're going to leave it there. That seems like enough for this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, we're going to jump back into talking about finance. We're going to talk about what determines interest rates. We'll talk a little bit about capital flows between countries. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at bond markets and stock markets. Let me encourage you particularly for those of you who are not that familiar with finance, and I know when it comes to this topic, there's a big variety of background knowledge. Some of you might, have some familiarity with how stock markets work and what a bond is. And then there's others of you who probably have never spent 2 seconds thinking about this. And so chapter 10 is a good chapter, particularly for those of you who don't really have a lot of the background information to read carefully. Particularly toward the end of the chapter, there's a lot of just definitional things in the chapter. And while I'm going to talk about some of those things tomorrow, I'm not going to go through it in great detail. I'm going to assume that you have some knowledge of this. So if you don't, make sure that you spend a little bit more time reading and getting caught up on some of the definitions that I'm going to use tomorrow, okay? Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a good evening. We'll see you back here in the morning. I know that I talked to a couple of you about talking to you after class. If you want to stay on, if you want to talk to me, stay on the Zoom, and then I will put you in a breakout room where you can wait for me while I talk to you individually, okay? So anyway, if you want to talk to me for a couple of minutes, because I have about a half an hour here, so just stay on the Zoom, and I have to talk to you one-on-one, all right? Okay, have a good evening, everybody.